Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. David Sedlak to the Water Shelf Podcast. Dr. Sedlak is the Plato Malozemoff Professor of Environmental Engineering at University of California, Berkeley. In 2016, he was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, one of the highest honors given to an engineer. Dr. Sedlak is director of the Berkeley Water Center, deputy director of the National Science Foundation's Engineering Research Center for Reinventing the Nation's Urban Water Infrastructure, which has the excellent acronym of ReNUWIt, and master cartographer for the National Alliance for Water Innovation. Dr. Sedlak is the author of Water 4.0, The Past, Present, and Future of the World's Most Vital Resource, published by Yale University Press in 2014. However, today we are going to talk to him about his brand new book entitled Water for All, Global Solutions for a Changing Climate, also published by Yale University Press just this past year in 2023. David, I am thrilled to speak with you about this exciting new book.
I'm very happy to be here to be one of your first interviewees on the podcast.
I had a great pleasure of meeting you at the Urban Water Institute conference 2 weeks ago, where we spoke to a very receptive audience of water industry professionals, where you spoke to this audience. My sense, however, after reading your book is that it is written for a much broader audience than just us water folks. So my first question is, whom do you consider to be the intended audience for Water for All? Or another way of asking might be, who do you want most to read your book?
Oh, golly. This is a question my wife asked me after I gave her one of the chapters, because unlike Water 4.0, the book gets into some of the details and some of the nuances of water. And so I thought of someone who is a little like me in terms of their curiosity when they read a nonfiction book. That is, someone who's willing to put in a little bit more effort to understand that it's more than just a superficial view at what kinds of challenges people are facing, that every water problem has a slightly different set of conditions around it. That means that the solutions that people come up with maybe aren't always going to be useful in every location, and that there will be pros and cons of everything that we do. And that's the way the world really works. And so I appreciate when I read a book that the author respects me as a reader enough to let me know that there are no silver bullets that solve all of our problems, that every approach comes with its compromises, and that the answer to problems are not always obvious to the people who are going through the challenge at the moment. So if you want a book that's maybe a little bit lighter and a quicker read, maybe Water 4.0 was that book. This book is the kind of book that I think it's hopefully easy to read and fun to read, but you may not read it all in one sitting.
Well, that's exactly how I found it. I found it incredibly approachable, but boy, it was thick with information, just all sorts of knowledge about all various aspects of water. And so it took a number of sittings, and I enjoyed every single sitting. It was a book to kind of take in bites, but very approachable. A question I wanted to ask you is, did you find it difficult? You have so much deep knowledge and expertise in this field of water. Did you find it difficult to write a book that was so approachable to the general reader, even with the immense amount of information that it contained?
Writing the book took me about 4.5 years. I don't write full time. I have a day job, so my writing happens in the mornings before things really get going. But I wrote and rewrote every chapter from different angles to make sure that I wasn't getting bogged down with things that people wouldn't understand, that the stories I would tell would be relatable and understandable, but they wouldn't lose that nuance. And so that required each chapter to be rewritten painstakingly, and I hope that the end result is that you don't notice it. You think that they just were written in one sitting, but each of them had a fair amount of effort behind them to make sure that they weren't confusing or, worse yet, sleep-inducing.
Right, and the big it's so much effort it takes to be effortless or to come across as effortless. It takes a huge amount of effort, I think, in the writing field. Before we get into the book itself, I'm just kind of curious: was there any particular book or books on your water shelf, virtual or actual, if you consider all your books on a shelf there in front of you, that inspired you to write or inspired you while you were writing Water for All? Was there a book in your mind that kept coming back to you while you were writing?
There's no one book that served as an inspiration or a model for writing Water for All. And in fact, I really tried to put out of my head other books that I'd written. So I was influenced by the thinking from others on the topic of water, and I'd seen the approaches that other authors had taken. I think what most I wanted to communicate in this book was the kind of detail and substance that we might find in a book like Cadillac Desert or Norris Hundley's The Great Thirst, that really kind of someone could command this complicated world and break it down to the things that really had the biggest impact. So I think this particular book, I was very influenced by some of those more detailed books, not only about water, but also in general topics where authors succeed in bringing knowledge to people who aren't really experts in the field. So that could be anything like, Thomas Piketty's economics books, or Aldo Leopold's books, or but like I say, Uncanny Almanac, or maybe even Thomas Pinker's books about sociology and social sciences. These are the kinds of things that I think are the maybe the slower reads, the more contemplative reads that influence my thinking about how to write this book.
Fantastic. Let's dive into Water for All. What would you say is the thesis or the central argument for the book?
A little like what I learned in writing Water 4.0 is that change comes to water systems during times of great crises, and that oftentimes the institutions and the decision makers in the water field are resistant to change. And that's because they recognize the risks associated with taking drastic action. So water systems tend to change incrementally. It tends to be an inherently conservative field, and no one wants to go first with something new. And so you'll have periods where maybe individuals or organizations are experimenting with new ways of doing things. But it's not until people reach the conclusion that the existing ways of doing things won't work anymore that we see rapid change. And in these periods of recognized crisis, there's a window of opportunity that opens, and we can start pioneering new approaches that might get us to a different place. So my thesis in the book is that the rate of change or the rate of crisis is accelerating, and that we're going to have to start planning in advance and anticipating some of the water crises that we'll face, especially as the impacts of climate change become greater. But it's also that there are many, many great ideas that are already out there that are just waiting for us to pick up and run with and adapt to our own circumstances that will allow us to realize this idea of water for all without a lot of suffering on the way.
I would love to come back to that idea of us having to make decisions that we might not want to make. I thought that came across as a profound theme in the book. You mentioned your prior book, and I mentioned it earlier, Water 4.0, and that was published about a decade ago. Would you consider Water for All an update to or a sequel to Water 4.0, or how do you think the books compare to or interact with each other more than what you've already talked about?
I wrote Water 4.0 in part in response to my own personal experiences being involved with changes in water systems in places like Southern California and Singapore. And after writing that book and after interacting with others who have been facing water crises, I've realized that I'd only touched one corner of the world's water crisis. I'd written a book about water crises that were being experienced by rich people who lived in cities. And I wanted to write a book that was about the rest of the water challenges that people face, recognizing that the experiences of rich people who live in cities often create technologies and policy approaches that can be repurposed in places where people aren't quite as wealthy.
You identify 6 water crises in the world, and I thought that was a really great way of capturing and but also diving into the various water crises. Would you care to just describe those 6 crises and how that helped formulate and even structure the book in what you were trying to say?
Yes, sure, Justin. I mean, the real place I started was to recognize that when we think about drinking water, the crises that you face depend upon your level of wealth and the water system that serves you. So we have this first crisis, the crisis of the wealthy, and that's the people who live in North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, places like that, where we're served by municipal water utilities that, when a crisis happens, might be able to spend some serious money building new infrastructure or investing in things like seawater desalination plants and water recycling plants. But that's only about 1 billion people of the 8 billion people on Earth. And so the rest of the world, when they face drinking water crises, they fit into one of 2 other water crises. The first of which I call water for the many, because most people on Earth who have access to water live in cities and they have piped water of some kind. Maybe it comes into their house, maybe they go and find that water somewhere, but those utilities in low and middle income countries keep the water flowing. It just may not flow 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it may not be safe to drink, but possibly more importantly, those utilities have trouble raising revenue because their customers can't pay as much money. So some of these advanced technologies may not be as easily accessible to them. And then there's the drinking water crisis of the unconnected. So in the world, there's still close to 1 billion people who lack access to an improved water supply. That means that they're either walking great distances and hauling water home, or they're getting water from an open well or a river or a lagoon of some kind. And they face a different kind of public health risk and a different set of choices when they face water scarcity that people who have a pipe to get water from wouldn't. So those are the first 3 crises. The fourth crisis is also a crisis of drinking water, but it's a crisis of water that's not safe to drink. So the first 3 crises are mainly about water quantity, but I decided to lump the crisis of water quality together because the contaminants in our water affect us all, and many of the challenges of dealing with them are similar, whether we're wealthy or poor, connected or unconnected. So arsenic in drinking water, some people think about that as a problem of places like Bangladesh and India and Vietnam, but there are plenty of people in wealthy countries like the United States that have arsenic in their drinking water. And if it's in a household well, you have some of the same problems that someone in Bangladesh has. There's just not an easy solution for it. And that's also true of the synthetic organic chemicals that we often find in our drinking water. So, PFAS we often think about as a problem facing wealthy people who rely upon water, but those industrial chemicals like PFAS are distributed around the world, and I'm sure if we looked a little harder, we'd find more PFAS contaminated drinking water in low and middle income countries. The fifth water crisis is a crisis of water for food. So, and here it was worthwhile to distinguish between the impacts of not having enough water to grow food on the rural communities where agriculture is important to the economy and lifestyle, and the effects of water scarcity on the food supply or on food security. And I think those are two related but slightly different issues. Here in the United States or in other wealthy countries, oftentimes the crisis of not having enough water for food is one of the way it affects rural economies. That is, there aren't people going hungry because of a drought in the United States or Australia, but there are farmers who are suffering and there are rural communities that suffer. Whereas in lower income countries, oftentimes water scarcity can create both an economic hardship and lead to food insecurity. And then finally, the last crisis is the crisis that the environment faces, and that's a crisis of water quantity and water quality. When we take water out of the environment for our cities, for our industry, to grow food, we're also depriving the environment of water. So we're often changing the amount of water in the environment, and we're also discharging a lot of our waste to the environment, whether it's agricultural runoff or municipal runoff. Those can cause crises in ecosystems, and I think that's worth calling out separately from the others.
It's just a remarkable way of seeing the water issue through so many different lenses, but also how they interact. I mean, you were just describing and also describing a solution in the book about running the rivers, which I love that image, where we need to manage our river systems because there's so many different aspects to the water, from urban drawing water from the river to disposing of water into the river to downstream uses with agriculture, the environment, all of these various aspects. You talk in Water for All, as you mentioned, about there being a way for best practices that have been developed, say in certain sectors, or to address certain crises, like in the wealthy countries, currently potentially available or have been developed that could be used to address other crises. What would you say is a current best practice that is the most readily available for adoption elsewhere in the world to address an existing water crisis? Does one immediately come to mind?
Well, after writing the book, I recognized, I broke down the solutions to the solutions that are primarily related to things like conservation and management practices, because I think this is where we should go first. We shouldn't be in a hurry to start building new infrastructure and adopting cool new technologies. And so certainly the place you always want to start is taking a look at the efficiency through which you use water. But notwithstanding that, I think that after writing the book and looking back, I think that I noticed a theme of the implications of the reverse osmosis membrane. And I think the story of how this technology has started to transform the way that that water systems respond to crises is important to me, because it shows that sometimes technology can have impacts that go far beyond what people initially expected. So, the story of the reverse osmosis membrane is that it is a technological innovation from the 1960s that was spurred on by U.S. government investments during the Kennedy administration. And it took about 40 years to mature. But once it matured, it quickly found applications in many different sectors. So first, we see the reverse osmosis membrane being used to help reduce the costs of desalinating seawater. And so in period of about 20 years, you saw that when people were building seawater desalination plants, they moved away from thermal technologies to reverse osmosis. And we've gotten to a point where for many cities and wealthy countries, the next best source of water in terms of cost and reliability is often desalinated seawater. So whether it's Perth in Australia or cities in the Middle East or in Spain or Israel, you'll see the adoption of reverse osmosis seawater desalination. But it doesn't stop there, and I think that's what makes it interesting to me. So under the sink reverse osmosis units that, here in the US you can buy at the hardware store for a few $100s, are starting to have impacts in low-income countries where entrepreneurs are setting up water kiosks where they can now compete with the water tanker trucks that sell bottled water or water for people to use in their homes, and you can have local enterprises taking that on. Or if you look to India and China, where the under the sink reverse osmosis sales are increasing by many percent per year. Now people who have water that comes into their home that may not be safe to drink because of contamination in the distribution system or inadequate treatment at the drinking water treatment plant have the means to bump up the quality when it comes into their homes. And so we're seeing that one invention from almost 60 years ago starting to permeate many different ways that people use water and be repurposed for solving crises. And in many ways, I see analogies to like the rooftop solar panels, photovoltaics, where we see photovoltaics being used on homes in wealthy countries or being used for solar farms for utility scale electricity production, but also being used for remote villages and providing lighting and access to electricity in places that don't have power plants. And so very kind of ready for adoption kind of technologies.
And it's an amazing how diverse that the applicability of that technology can be. Everyone thinks desalination ocean, but you spend some time in the book, which I found very valuable, talking about brackish inland water resources also being desalinated and how that is creating new water supplies. That's something we deal with here currently in the Chino groundwater basin where I do my work. We have desalters for groundwater that has too much salt, and it's driving the entire management of this groundwater basin. And there's all sorts of different stories like that you tell in the book. One other fascinating idea, and that is the idea of what I would call a bottled water sin tax, or what you call a micro levy on bottled water sales, that could actually generate millions of dollars potentially to help support international water and sanitation development. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this idea as well and where it might be heading and how people feel about it.
This was an idea that was proposed to some degree by some non-governmental organizations in Europe and was initially embraced by the bottled water industry. Bottled water over the years has gotten a bad rap from people who complain about the pollution and the kind of lack of a need for bottled water. So this idea that you could donate to charity a very small amount of money, a fraction of a penny for every bottle of water sold, and then you could use it to address the issues of water and sanitation among the unconnected. I found it initially intriguing because it taps into this idea that many people working together could help solve a problem. If there's close to 1 billion people still lacking access to safe and affordable water, maybe the other 7 billion people could help them get there. I think it's lost a little bit of momentum because the folks who are in the bottled water industry have turned their attention more towards plastic pollution and this issue of microplastics in the environment, and they're probably not as concerned as they once were about being seen as the ones who help solve the water accessibility crisis. So I doubt that that's going to take us where we need to go, but I think that the take-home point to me is that by making the issue of access to safe and affordable water something that people in wealthy and middle income countries see all the time, we might be able to provide more resources, because ultimately those challenges are going to need outside assistance to make them disappear faster.
Yes, I believe you mentioned in another part of the book that there is a certain number of people by 2030 that will still, and it's a large number of people, I think 300 million who will lack access to basic water and sanitation. And the investment to actually address this would be roughly about $20 billion a year, or, for the billion or so people who have access to that water, it would be about $20 a year per person. And I found that to be, for each of us, if we spent $20 a year, we could actually provide that amount of reliable water service to others. It's a remarkable thing to hold in your head, what could be done to solve these issues.
But remember that has to happen along with the backdrop of also, infectious diseases and nutrition and roads and education. And so there are a lot of needs demanding those development dollars that are out there in the world. So while I think that pushing for more charitable contributions and more aid is part of the solution to water accessibility, the other is going to be helping those countries continue to undergo economic development, because as countries become wealthy, people not only move out of poverty, they move into water access and water safety. And so anything that we can do to improve people's overall economic situation is likely to help address some of these water crises of the unconnected.
Sure. Pulling back a bit, you end your book by telling us that inadequacies in the approaches developed by our ancestors, along with a climate that they had not anticipated, are forcing us to rethink nearly every facet of water management. And you also say that although we might resist it for a few more years, change is inevitable. We're talking to each other right now on Super Tuesday, where a lot of choices are being made, but it occurs to me that we are sometimes forced to make choices that we do not want to make. So is that part of the resistance, or are there other aspects of the challenge that we need to overcome?
I think there are two pieces to this question. The first is hesitancy about spending money and the risks associated with changing what we do. And so that, when you look back historically at water systems, has always been the issue, is that anyone who works in the municipal water sector knows that one of the worst things you can do is raise the customer's bills too quickly. That's how you get thrown out of office or fired. So, that recognition of challenge that requires something different often requires crisis, and that's unfortunate. But the other is, coming to recognize that we have the means to create water systems that will serve us better and address all of these different crises that we run across. And rather than playing whack-a-mole and waiting for a new crisis to arise and spending money to patch it up with shovel-ready approaches, is that if we gave it a little bit more thought about what we want our water to do and how much of an investment we're willing to make to assure we don't run into crisis, we might be able to ultimately end up in a better place.
What, for those listening to this podcast, or even better yet, reading your excellent book, what is one thing that individuals can do to accomplish water for all? How can we be involved?
There's so many different things that we can do to be involved in water for all. I guess at an individual level, recognizing where our water comes from and the sacrifices that are made to deliver it to us is a first step. So thinking not only about whether you'll have enough water, but whether taking that water out of the environment is causing a problem somewhere else, or where your food's being grown and how much water was needed to do it. That might change our behavior and get us to adopt conservation and different practices. But ultimately, I think the other recognition is that, to me, that's very important, is that water is essential to life, and that there's a right of individuals to water, and there's a right of the environment to water. And so this is a shared resource. And if we can use it wisely and invest in it, it should be able to be something that we won't have to worry about and experience crisis with.
Hear, hear. Just a couple of last questions about your book itself. In addition to Water 4.0, what books would you like to see next to Water for All on the virtual water shelf? You know, if you had a shelf of books and they weren't just alphabetical, are there specific books that you think pair well with yours, that you see in dialogue with it, or either reinforcing or even challenging its arguments?
So, first of all, I wanted to say that I really love the books that you have on your water shelf, and they are books that many of them I've read and have learned a lot from. I'll add a couple more that have influenced me that might be a little bit less obvious to people. One is The Water Kingdom, A Secret History of China by Philip Ball. It came out a couple years ago, and it tells the story about how water's been integral to the development of China throughout history. And then another book that maybe influenced me more when I was writing Water 4.0 was Martin Malozzi's The Sanitary City, which was a story about the development of the U.S. told through the lens of sanitation. And I think that, plus some of the other works contemporaneous of that time by people like Abel Woolman, had a big impact on my understanding of infrastructure in the U.S. But I think you've got a wonderful bookshelf there, and your readers and audience will find endless entertainment.
Well, it's probably going to be ever changing. I am going to find a place for Water for All on that top 20 list. It's an amazing book. Last question: how has the book been received? What kind of reaction are you getting from the book so far?
Well, the book came out in November, and these days books get going slowly. I think I've had some wonderful discussions, especially with people who are directly involved in the water field or who've been peripherally involved, like architects and people who work for cities and who weren't trained necessarily as engineers, and they've engaged me in some really wonderful conversations and have taught me some things. So I'm hoping that people listening to this podcast and others who read the book will continue to raise questions about it, and we'll all be able to learn from the experience of laying out these water systems in one place.
I think that your book really coming at a very key moment where lots of discussion about water, a lot of books coming out about water, wonderful books that can really drive the conversation and really drive us to do better in terms of tackling some of these challenges that, as you say in the book, we need to take some immediate actions, some near-term actions to address issues that may develop throughout the rest of the century. And that was a very sobering context for the book, but the book gives you so much. It gives the reader so much that can be done. It is an incredibly positive and I would say very inspiriting read. Thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. We've been speaking with Dr. David Sedlak about his recently published book, Water for All, Global Solutions for a Changing Climate, published by Yale University Press in 2023, available wherever you find books. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Water Shelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.